Your host for the evening. It's not going to be quite as exciting as last month when Lori Day was the host, but she's much nicer looking than I am. Love you too, Dan. I want to welcome everybody tonight, both first-timers, long-timers, members and non-members. It's, of course, this event is free for members. It's just one of the millions and millions of benefits you receive when you become a Yankee Air Museum member. For the members, we do ask for donations, $5 for each of the members on the way out. We've got a box over here that's hungry. We've got another one in the hallway that's not quite as hungry because you've likely fed this one even more than this one out here. So on the way out, if you could drop a $5 bill for each one of the members. Non-members you have paid to get in, so that's up to you. A donation of $5 for each member here tonight will allow us to continue bringing these new and interesting speakers from all over the country. As far as upcoming events, we really don't have much through the summer other than air adventure rides. So let's talk about that. This Sunday, the 7th, the B-17 will be flying out of Hangar 1 doing adventure rides. Should be the final air adventure ride out of Hangar 1, because we're very shortly going to be moving into the new Roush Aeronautics Center. So on Sunday, August 21st, the C-47 and hopefully the B-25 will be flying out of the new Roush Aeronautics Center. As always, please check the website, www.yankeeairmuseum.org, for any more information on these and any new upcoming events. Now I'd like to ask that you turn your cell phones to stun or off. Please hold all your questions until the Q&A session at the end. On the 22nd of May, 1942, Mexico declared war on the Axis powers. While Mexico made many contributions to the war effort, one stands out from the rest. A Mexican unit, for the first time, was sent to make war on a foreign soil. Mexico's 201st Fighter Squadron, the Aztec Eagles, flying Republic P-47 Thunderbolt aircraft while facing obstacles of politics and prejudice, earned an impressive record in the Pacific. Join me now in welcoming a true blue, bona fide Kentucky colonel. He's got the medal card to prove it. The history guy, Mr. Lance Geiger.
That's for real. And I told him to say that because I just, like 2 weeks ago, that came in the mail. So I am a Kentucky colonel. I'm a colonel every bit as much as Colonel Sanders. But I'm told that includes no free chicken. And I do have a card if you want to see it. I have proof that I'm a Kentucky colonel.
I've seen it. It's true.
It's true. It's real. It's a real association. I'm Lance. On YouTube, though, I'm the history guy. I make short history documentaries, mostly really storytelling. Some of you might have seen my channel before. I've been doing that since 2017, and to date I've made between 800 and 900 short documentaries. So if you haven't started watching, start now because it's going to take you a while. You can find me by searching The History Guy on YouTube or on Rumble, or you can go to historyguy.com, thehistoryguy.com, that's our website, and all the videos are there. I don't specialize in aviation. As in fact, my most popular video last month was the history of baloney. Literal baloney, not figurative, real actual baloney. And my most popular video ever is why Canada uses a different screwdriver than the United States, which is a good story. But that would be too much of a digression, so I won't go into it here. But I do a lot of aviation history, and actually aviation history is kind of what built my channel. It was very small until a particular episode that I did about Pan Am Flight 6, if you know that ditched in the ocean off of between Hawaii and California. That video struck big, and that's when my channel began to grow. And now it's a fairly popular channel. Last month, people spent around.
You exceeded your time.
Oh, turn it on, it helps, right?
How's that?
Hey. I didn't say, is this thing on part? Did you miss anything in the back? I'm a Kentucky colonel, that's all you missed. Last month, people spent somewhere around 400,000 hours watching my channel in July of this year. it's been viewed more than 25 million times. And so that's, of course I'm blowing my own horn, I guess that's all I'll say. I make these things in my basement. I can't imagine how much time people spend. Of course, that amount of time, if it were applied well, could have cured cancer, but instead they were watching my history documentaries. But given what's on YouTube, that people are taking the time to watch history and learn about history, I'm rather proud of that, given that there are many other choices on YouTube. I might get more views if I strapped a GoPro to my cat or shoved fireworks down my underwear, but I like what I do and I'm proud of it. I do focus on what I call forgotten history, which is, of course, a bit of a misnomer because it was truly forgotten, and how did I know about it? But that is, it's lesser known history, lesser known tidbits of history. I don't think many people knew the history of baloney. That seems to be what the general consensus is. But if you watch my channel, you know that I believe that forgotten history deserves to be remembered. And the topic that I have for tonight, I think, is truly one of those. When discussing the contributions of the Allied nations during the Second World War, Mexico is not the first nation that tends to come to mind. Yet they did deploy a fighter squadron to the Pacific, a fact that is little remembered on either side of the border. The deployment of the 201st Fighter Squadron, the Aztec Eagles, to the Pacific Theater represented the first and only deployment of Mexican troops in war outside of the borders of the Republic. And that is history that deserves to be remembered. The Mexican entry into the Second World War was a complex question. Mexico was deeply distrustful of the United States, which had troops occupying Mexican territory as recently as 1917. Douglas MacArthur himself had participated in the occupation of Veracruz in 1914. Even closer to the war, in 1938, the Mexican government had expropriated the national oil reserves and nationalized the oil industry, and that caused a rift with both the United States and the United Kingdom, which had the United Kingdom had severed diplomatic ties with Mexico and called for a boycott of Mexican goods. So you can see why it might be difficult for Mexico to join the Allies. Moreover, in general, Mexican foreign policy had always been semi-isolationist, largely as a response to decades of foreign intervention in Mexico. If you know the history of Mexico, they certainly knew the consequences of foreign intervention, and they weren't interested in foreign intervention themselves. And the Constitution of Mexico gave the president no constitutional authority to deploy troops outside of Mexico. There was no one in Mexico who was actually authorized to send troops to war outside of the Republic. And in general, the population of Mexico did not consider the war to be their concern. But Mexico had taken a strong anti-fascist stance in the 1930s, providing financial support to the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War and protesting the German annexation of Austria, the Anschluss in 1938. They'd taken a strong diplomatic stance against Italy for its invasion of Ethiopia, against Japan for its actions in Manchuria. In mid-1941, Mexico had banned export of strategic goods to Japan because of the invasion in Manchuria. And they had continued to recognize legitimate governments in exile, for example, the Polish government, after their countries had been occupied. So clearly their sympathy was with the Allies, even though they were very mistrustful of the United States and the United Kingdom. They certainly had reasons to suspect the Axis. According to the New York Times, the Mexican army intercepted a Japanese plan to invade the United States via the Sea of Cortez on the Pacific coast. And in that plan, troops would land in the state of Sonora in northwestern Mexico and drive north into the vulnerable American Southwest. So Mexico had reason to be concerned that either Germany or Japan might be interested in invading Mexico as a means of attacking the United States. The United States and Mexico signed a general agreement on November 19, 1941 that settled outstanding economic claims that had to do with the expropriation of the oil, and pledged U.S. support to stabilize the peso. So we provided some economic support to stabilize what was a burgeoning economic crisis in Mexico. Mexico also appreciated that its national defense benefited from cooperation with the United States. And the two would have to work together for any reasonable defense of North America. So even as a semi-isolationist state, they realized that they might have to defend North America, and that would require cooperation with the United States. And the Mexican and the United States military at the time maintained informal connections. When Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, Mexico severed diplomatic relations with the Axis powers and started increasing their defensive measures. Only a month after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. and Mexico announced a joint commission to coordinate a wartime defense of North America. So we were cooperating in defense of North America. Mexico also worked to convince other Latin American states to break ties with the Axis and to coordinate the defense of the Americas. A lot of that cooperation came down to assistance in patrolling for U-boats off the American coast. And that was a number of South American, Central American nations, as well as Mexico, participated in that. Excuse me, and also they resumed relations with the United Kingdom. This period also included, I think, one of the things that is least remembered in the Second World War when we talk about forgotten history. But for fear of sabotage from fifth column elements, Mexico forcibly relocated all residents of Japanese ancestry from the western part of the country. They were required to move at their own expense. They were only given 10 days to settle their affairs, and much of their property was confiscated without compensation. That is, of course, something that we remember well in the United States, and we were not the only country where that happened. Mexico became a primary supplier of materials to the United States, a lot of very important materials. They started receiving aid that helped to develop Mexican industry, but Mexico was still officially neutral. That changed. Germany had extended its U-boat campaign into the Gulf of Mexico. And on May 14, 1942, the oil tanker SS Potrero de Llano was sunk by a torpedo from the U-564, despite flying clearly illuminated flags of Mexico, a neutral nation. 13 of the crew died, including the captain and the deck crew, while 22 were rescued by the United States Coast Guard. The ship burned spectacularly within sight of Miami Beach. Having severed diplomatic relations with Germany, Mexico officially protested via the Swedish embassy because that was the nation which maintained relations with both. And Foreign Minister Ezequiel Pazia Peñazola said of the sinking, it was not only an aggression against the most elementary humanitarian principles, but a flagrant violation of international law. But while the Germans later claimed that the sinking was a mistake based on the U-boat captain's misidentification of the tanker's flag, Mexico received no official response from the Axis over its demand for an explanation and compensation. And then less than a week later, a second tanker, the SS Paja de Oro, returning empty to Mexico having unloaded its cargo, was sunk by the U-106 near Key West, Florida. On May 28th, Mexican President Avila Camacho asked a joint session of the Mexican legislature to declare war and officially signed the declaration of war on June 2nd. While the Senate and Chamber of Deputies were behind the president, though, polls at the time suggested that much of the populace was still opposed to entering the war. In terms of the conflict, the economic cooperation between the United States and Mexico had by far the largest effect. Mexico was the single largest supplier of war material to the United States during the war, something I don't think many of us really know. In exchange, U.S. funding helped to develop Mexican industries so dramatically that the effect has been called the Mexican miracle. That's the money that we spent to build infrastructure in order to produce all those materials that were being sent to the United States. Mexico also supplied farm labor, which helped to reduce a labor shortage in the United States. Militarily, cooperation and Lend-Lease modernized the Mexican military, which participated in the Battle of the Caribbean, which was the effort to fight U-boats in the Gulf of Mexico, against U-boat activity. The prime U.S. interest, though, was that Mexico be better prepared to defend its own borders, as Mexico offered numerous bays and landing points where Axis spies and saboteurs would be able to land and attack economic interests both in Mexico, and the U.S. cooperation on counterintelligence operations allowed a disruption of Axis spy rings. However, and this is important too, and another thing I don't think many Americans know, thousands of Mexican nationals in the United States volunteered for U.S. service, serving with distinction in all theaters, in all branches of the military. An estimated 15,000 to 30,000 Mexican citizens served in U.S. armed forces during the Second World War, alongside some 500,000 Mexican Americans. The Second War Powers Act of 1942 authorized expedited naturalization for non-citizens that served in the military. So we certainly have a debt of gratitude. But Mexico was not initially, as a country, prepared to become actively involved in the war overseas. Not only was public sentiment towards the war at best lukewarm, but the Mexican Constitution gave the president no authority to allow Mexican military to serve overseas. And the Mexican military lacked any logistical infrastructure needed to deploy its military outside the borders of the republic. It had simply never been a consideration. It's something the nation had never done. When Presidents Roosevelt and Camacho met in Monterrey in April of 1943, Roosevelt reportedly pushed for Mexico to take part in offensive military action against the Axis. But Camacho was still non-committal, and that had to do with the constitutional restrictions. By 1944, however, Camacho had decided that Mexico needed to demonstrate that it was as committed to the war as other allies if it wanted to have a greater voice in wartime strategy and post-war diplomacy. In November 1943, he announced that Mexico was prepared to deploy a military force if it was to operate in a defined sector and under Mexican command, So they didn't want it to be diluted, and they didn't want it to be under foreign command. They wanted to have a single Mexican command that would be in a single theater. Now, at that point in the war, in 1943, if Mexico wanted to meaningfully enter the war, really only one thing made sense, and that was deploying an air unit. And the reason is an air unit would require a smaller number of men be deployed and trained. It would reduce the potential number of casualties compared to a ground force. And that was important given the already shaky public support for foreign deployment. And tactically, an air unit could better seek combat with a retreating Axis force, which was the overall war situation in 1943. Had they been sending a ground combat element, it would have been difficult to get them into combat, but you can follow them with aircraft. The U.S. also had experience organizing and training the Brazilian 1st Fighter Group, and that's another thing not well known in the United States. There was a Brazilian force that fought in the Second World War, including a fighter group and a brigade, an entire ground brigade. The fighter group, the Brazilian 1st Fighter Group, had been deployed successfully in the Mediterranean. And a plan to establish and train a Mexican combat pursuit squadron was sent to FDR, was supported by George Messersmith, who was the U.S. ambassador to Mexico. While the use of aircraft by the Mexican military went all the way back to the Mexican Revolution, at the outset of the war, the Mexican Air Force was small and its equipment outdated. Mexico had no modern pursuit planes of any kind. It had no indigenous airplane industry of any kind. Entry into the war offered the opportunity, though, for lend-lease, and equipment was quickly modernized, including Douglas A-24B Banshee dive bombers, North American B-25 Mitchells, and consolidated PBY Catalinas, all of which would be useful for patrolling Mexican waters and defending its coasts, the Battle of the Caribbean. The United States and Mexico entered into agreements for the unlimited reciprocal use of airfields and facilities, as well as the establishment of a number of bases in Mexico by the U.S. Army Air Forces to train personnel. Basically, pilot training was done at Guadalajara, Mexico, basic training was, and then the students were moved to the United States Army Air Force schools in the United States for advanced and individual unit training. With the help of the U.S. Army Air Force, Mexico trained enough pilots and ground crew to equip 3 squadrons. And one of those squadrons, eventually called Squadron 201, would be sent to fight overseas. A competitive process was used to select 300 men, 33 pilots, and the rest ground crew for the squadron under the command of Colonel Antonio Cardenas Rodriguez. On July 20th, 1944, they passed the review before President Camacho. Interesting story there. As they were passing in review, the president reminded them of their importance of the mission, but then they offered the men to petition me for whatever you may desire. Now that offer was apparently just a formal offer, but it was meant to be ceremonial. And so to everybody's surprise, a young soldier stepped forward. And he said, "Sir, I request that a school be built in my hometown." The request was granted. The school still stands today and is still in use. Pilot Carlos Corona said in a 2006 documentary, "Leaving my family in Mexico was the hardest thing. But when you are in the military, you must follow orders. You have to proceed with the mission." That's extraordinary for Mexico, which had never proceeded beyond its borders for such a mission. And it shows the commitment of the young men who volunteered for the 201st. The squadron arrived by train to the United States on July 25th to begin advanced training. There was a ceremony when they arrived, and one pilot recalled, "On the North American side, we felt ignored. Few people attended, even if only out of curiosity." In general, when you hear the members of the Aztec Eagles speaking, they refer to the United States as North America. I guess assuming that Mexico is not North America. So we're the North Americans, if you were wondering what that is. Initial training took place in San Antonio, and it's interesting here, they received some of the training from pilots of the WASP, the Women's Air Force Service pilots. One of the pilots recalled, "One day, I was sent to instrument training, and I was very surprised that my instructor was a woman. And she was very pretty, too. I was very impressed." When I did a tour today of the museum, it's interesting because you have actually there's a vignette in there, a diorama of a WASP doing instrument training, and that's exactly what they did with the pilots of the Mexican Air Force. And if you've ever seen pictures of the WASP, they were an attractive bunch. I can understand why he was impressed. Advanced training occurred in Idaho, where they trained on the aircraft to which they'd been assigned, the Republic P-47D Thunderbolt, which was the same aircraft used by the Brazilian 1st Fighter Squadron. Some consider the P-47 to be behind the faster P-51, but the Thunderbolt was very popular with its crews. The New York Times wrote of the P-47, "Designed as a fighter, the aircraft was also a flying tank, capable of close air support, dropping 500-pound bombs and unloading its 50 caliber guns with ferocious generosity." Reinforced armor underneath also made the plane able to take damage as much as it could dish out. By all accounts, the 201st was very happy with the plane to which they'd been assigned. American flyers finally called the aircraft the Jug, and if you've seen one, you understand that from the shape. And the Mexican aviators followed suit, referring to the new plane as El Jarro, which means the Jug. But actually deploying the squadron overseas would require the approval of the Mexican Senate, and that still did not come. And so they were aware that they might be training for a mission that would never come. In the United States, training was hampered by the language barrier, and there was at least one fatal accident that was primarily blamed on confused instructions. They also contended with occasional racism and discrimination, and the Army Air Force personnel had to finally go work with local communities to explain that the Mexicans were allies, and they had to be treated with respect. In general, you also find from members of the squadron that they thought that the American forces thought that they would be inferior pilots and tended to treat them poorly. Squadron members wore Mexican, not U.S. insignia, and they were technically not subject to U.S. law. During training, the squadron, which was labeled the 201st Fighter Squadron, took the nickname the Aztec Eagles. It's not really clear, though, if that was a unit choice or if that was something that developed through the Mexican press. The Mexican flyers adopted Walt Disney's cartoon character Panchito Pistoles as a mascot. Do you remember Panchito Pistoles? He was the dancing chicken in the Three Caballeros. He became the squadron's unofficial symbol and was described as a bombastic, trigger-happy caballero, which seemed to be a good fit. The Aztec Eagles flew with green, white, and red rudders, a representation of the three vertical fields of the Mexican flag. The Mexican Senate approved foreign combat operations in December 1944, and in January 1945, Mexico constituted the Mexican Expeditionary Air Force under Colonel Rodriguez, with the 201st as their operational unit. The squadron graduated training February 20th, 1945. Because of language and cultural affinity, it was decided to deploy the Aztec Eagles to the Philippines. President Camacho agreed on deployment in a conference with President Roosevelt, and to aid the liberation of people for whom it is felt a continuity of idiom, history, and traditions. In other words, we were sending to fight for someone who also spoke Spanish, generally the idea. We also find out from the members of the Aztec Eagles that they did find a lot of affinity with people of the Philippines, and fairly quickly picked up the local dialect. They arrived in Manila aboard the USS Fair Isle on April 30th, assigned to the 58th Fighter Group of the 5th Air Force. In 2008, pilot Renato Gallardo, the son of a Mexican general, recalls thinking that the Americans looked down on us a little bit. And so he would give an example of that. While on a joint mission, he got into an argument with an American pilot over the radio. He explained this in a newspaper in 2003. We strafed a column of Japanese vehicles, and after I made my pass, I got a little crazy and maneuvered my plane into a celebratory roll. One of the U.S. pilots chastised Gallardo over the onboard intercom, saying, "Look at that crazy Mexican." Gallardo was offended by the comment, and their ensuing in-flight communication led to a challenge to settle the argument behind the hangar once they landed. Gallardo had no idea which of the Americans he was talking to. He challenged the man to a fight, and when they landed, he found out that the man was, quote, about 3 times as big and 4 times as heavy. And the man asked, "Do you still want to fight?" And he did not back down, and the two became friends. Among their first missions was to attack dug-in Japanese positions near the city of Vigan on the island of Luzon. It's a particular, I think it's pronounced vegan actually. It was a particularly difficult mission, as the only way to attack the positions required flying closely against a mountain range and executing dangerous dive bombing maneuvers. Their flying there quickly earned the respect of American pilots, who called them white noses because there was paint on their engine cowlings, white paint on the front of the engine cowlings. Gallardo said in 2006, "We made up our minds. We were going to show the North Americans what we can do. I want to do a good job. I'll get close to the target and make sure that I hit it good, that I cause a lot of damage." The squadron took its first combat loss on a particularly dangerous mission on June 1st, while attacking an ammunition depot so close to cliffs that the pilots had to dive bomb the target. Second Lieutenant Fausto Vega Santander, the squadron's youngest pilot, his nickname was Cachito, was either hit by ground fire or he lost control while he was trying to pull up from his dive. Flying with the insignia of the Mexican Air Force, the squadron flew more than 90 combat missions, completed 785 offensive sorties. They dropped nearly 250,000 pounds of bombs and expended 167,000 rounds of ammunition. They flew ground attack missions in support of the U.S. 25th Infantry Division, where they were credited with putting thousands of Japanese troops out of action. They also flew dangerous long-range reconnaissance raids over Formosa. Pilot Miguel Marina Arreola later said that we saw more frequent airplanes from Japan on that 650-mile trip than ever before, but they didn't want to have combat with us because they knew our P-47s were better than their Mitsubishis. They could fly higher and faster. We're seeing lots of Japanese aircraft, but the Japanese aircraft are running away from the Mexican Air Force. These 6+ hour missions were so grueling on the pilots that upon landing they were unable to climb out of the cockpits themselves. They had to be lifted out by the ground crews. During their combat service, the squadron received no replacements, and their combat effectiveness did slowly decline due to losses. It was only Japan's capitulation in August of 1945 that prevented more Mexican flyers. They were preparing 2 more squadrons from entering service. Those squadrons were scheduled to participate in the invasion of the Japanese home islands that was planned for November. But instead, we dropped atomic bombs, and the Aztec Eagles flew their last combat mission in August. They returned to the United States aboard the transport SS Sea Marlin, arriving first in San Pedro, California, where they were greeted with a celebration before boarding a train for El Paso. One pilot recalled, "As we traveled through the towns towards Mexico City, we were greeted by cheering crowds and confetti and marching bands. They were back in Mexico City. By November, President Camacho honored the men with the Medal of Service in the Far East. That is the only medal ever awarded to a Mexican military unit for valor serving abroad. In a radio address, President Camacho said of them, 'You return with glory, having complied brilliantly with your duty, and in these moments, in this historic plaza, you receive the gratitude of our people.'" While their service in the war zone was brief, their combat performance was comparable to any of the more veteran units of the 58th Fighter Group. Of their service in the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur said, "I have watched over its combat activities with growing pride and admiration. For that reason, upon leaving the Philippines, I have said goodbye to them with sadness and affection." While the economic ties with Mexico and the U.S. during the war certainly had a larger effect on the war, the combat performance of the Mexican Expeditionary Air Force represented a determined effort on the part of the Mexican government to make a direct contribution to the prosecution of the conflict, and took part in the face of significant obstacles. The 201st Fighter Squadron represents the first time Mexican forces had ever set foot on foreign soil to wage war, and it hasn't happened since. The overseas service did have meaning for Mexico. Because of its contributions to the war effort, Mexico received one of the first rotating seats on the United Nations Security Council. Relations were greatly improved between the two countries, and even if we see stresses between the United States and Mexico today, Mexican Marines, for instance, still train at Camp Pendleton, California, as a result of these agreements. But still their service meant controversy in a nation that was never fully sold on the war, more or less foreign deployment of Mexican troops. The 2018 edition of History Reader reported that after the war, the Aztec Eagles were welcomed back home with a grand parade in Mexico City before being promptly shuttled into the background of the national landscape. While there's a monument to the squadron in Mexico City's Chapultepec Park, the reader notes that locals seem generally unfamiliar with it. And when they asked directions to it, one local told them, "We do not concern ourselves with war." And because of that, the Aztec Eagles are relatively forgotten in Mexico, where they were not sure how to recognize their service. In all, the 201st lost 10 pilots killed. 4 of those were lost in training accidents in the United States. One whose plane went missing in bad weather was declared dead in 1947, and one of those died due to an illness contracted in the Philippines. The rest were combat casualties. 5 of the pilots of the 201st went on to become generals in the Mexican Air Force. I should mention, 10 pilots killed, if that doesn't sound like a lot. Remember, there were only 33 pilots in the 201st. So they took 1/3 casualties, roughly. In 2003, Gallardo told the newspaper La Prensa San Diego, "I was crazy about flying from the first time I heard about airplanes. We were eager to get even with the Japanese, but I think we did. I'm glad we had the opportunity to do it." I think we all agree that you could have heard the same thing from virtually any U.S. pilot of the war. Gallardo had joined the Mexican Air Force at the age of 14, passed away in October 2010. Aztec Eagle pilot Carlos Garduño Nunez said in 2006, "These men did their job well done. It serves as an example for our youth to be patriotic about their country, and we leave a legacy and example that the youth should follow." Colonel Nunez passed away on the 3rd of February, just this last year. He was 102 years old. He was the last surviving pilot. He was the last surviving pilot of the Aztec Eagles. They are now gone. But they deserve to be remembered. And it's up to subsequent generations like us to ensure that they are. I don't know how long it's going to go, so it's a little shorter than expected, but it's a lot longer than a history guy is. So. But we've got lots of time for questions.
Questions, anyone?
Got one.
Mm-hmm.
Why was Mexico so upset about Japan, since it was Germany who was sinking their ships?
Well, they had intercepted a cable saying Japan intended to invade Mexico.
Right.
But they also, they were simply anti-fascist. And Japan had invaded Manchuria, and by then that was well known, and the humanitarian crisis in Manchuria was well known. And so they were also mad at Italy, which wasn't sinking their ships because of their invasion of Ethiopia. And so I think it just had to do the same thing that made them semi-isolationist, made them very much offended by the imperialism of the Axis.
Okay. Thank you.
Did I read somewhere that Germany tried to get Mexico to be an ally? Is that?
I think you're probably thinking of the Zimmerman telegram, right?
didn't hear you.
Are you thinking of the Zimmerman telegram? I mean, there certainly was an instance where Germany sent a cable to Mexico saying, why don't you invade the United States and then we'll give you the Southwest. But that was in the First World War, and that was part of what drew the United States into the First World War. That was intercepted by the British. It was called the Zimmerman telegram because it came from a diplomat named Zimmerman. And that was part of what got the United States to move from neutrality, and he kept us out of war to end of the First World War. I don't know of any intent to try to draw Mexico into the war on the side of the Axis, but prior to the sinking of the ships, there was some support, there was some sympathy for the Nazi cause amongst the intelligentsia, maybe the university intelligentsia. But you could see generally that Mexico simply didn't agree with the general strategy of invading other countries, which was what the Axis was doing at the time. So I don't know of any sincere attempt to try to draw Mexico in now.
How big an air force would Mexico have today?
It's a wonderful question. I have no idea. I could look it up on my phone because that gives me some human knowledge. They don't keep a huge military, and the Mexican military is kind of interesting because they're never going to build a military that can take on the United States. And they don't have to build more military to take on if anybody, say, from south of their border tried to invade them. And so their military kind of sits at a sort of standard size. I don't know. I would have to look that up. 10 of the people who served with the Aztec Eagles eventually became generals in the Mexican military, or the Mexican Air Force. And they did all sorts of different things, too. The last guy I was talking about, Nunez, he was the president's pilot for a number of years.
You had mentioned that there was Mexico had entered the conflict. Did they declare war?
Yes, they declared war. Yeah,
Okay.
and after the sinking of the Oro, then he went to the Senate. So it was actually declared war. Of course, Costa Rica also declared war. Wasn't able to deploy any military, but they did declare war. And Mexico did help. Eventually several other, say, South American nations. Brazil was before Mexico, but Argentina eventually declared war too. And Mexico kind of helped to shift the opinion throughout Central and South America so that some others joined the cause. Their biggest effect being that they helped to patrol borders of the Americas for U-boat activity. Thanks. Sure.
Sorry if you watching late and you covered this already, but were they flying their own aircraft, or were
They were supplied with P-47D Thunderbolts. There was no indigenous Mexican industry for building aircraft, so through Lend-Lease we pretty much provided everything that they were using for. They had 3 squadrons, 2 of those stayed, defending the borders of Mexico, and 1 deployed, and it was all American aircraft.
Not a bad plane to have.
Yeah, it was not a bad plane. They liked it very much.
Yeah.
You said there was a monument to the Aztec Eagles. Where was that monument built, and do you know if it still exists?
It still
today?
exists. It's in Chapultepec Park, which is in Mexico City. And it's a very large park, and there's a lot of different monuments there, and so it can be difficult in the park to find where it is. And that's where, that newspaper article was someone was trying to find it, and no one there could point it out. But it is still there. I've seen pictures of it. There's an obelisk, and then there's a monument to the 10 pilots that died. So if you go to Mexico City, then you can still see it, yeah. And there has been a little bit more attention. I mean, it was ignored in Mexico for a very long time. But when Nunez died last February, it was well publicized throughout the nation that he was the last of the Aztec Eagles. So I think there's been sort of a renaissance in understanding what they contributed. Like the United States, we kind of figured out that we were losing our World War II veterans maybe a tad too late. But I kept mentioning things that were said in 2006 and 2003. Those were efforts that were made to take the remaining members of the Aztec Eagles and collect their stories. And that's why we have so many of those stories.
Did those pilots that returned form the basis of the Mexican Air Force?
Yes, like I said, 10 of them became generals in the Mexican Air Force. So yes, they did. And they continued using those American aircraft that were provided from Lindby.
Did we give them the P-47s?
Honestly, I don't know. I doubt they got to keep the planes that they were flying. But I'm sure we would have provided pursuit fighters of some sort. And again, I would have to look that up. I'm sorry, it's a good question. At the time, we might have been giving them P-51s too, because those were used fairly extensively in Central America.
Did we train those pilots, or were they already trained?
They got basic training in Mexico, but we did all of the advanced training. So some of them had been flying from a young age, but I mean, their aircraft in Mexico were all highly updated. But so some of them even got training from the WASP, which is an interesting crossover there. That you had these Mexican pilots who were facing discrimination. They were being trained by the girl pilots that the Americans never liked, and they produced a very good pilot squad.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of your videos. What's attractive is the length of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just,
this is 2 of those.
I'm just wondering how many hours of research does it take you to do a 15-minute video?
It always, I mean, always the assumption that it's a very long time. I put out a video 3 times a week, so if it takes me more than 2 days, I don't get Saturday off. So it takes about 2 days to take a video from inception to researched, script written, production made, and it's posting. And quite often, I'll be working at 11 at night to get it up the next day. Got a little bit ahead here so that I wasn't behind. We posted today, we'll be posting the day after tomorrow. But in general, it only takes about 2 days. Yeah. It's a busy job putting out 3 documentaries a week. You know?
Are they always topics that you're inherently kind of interested in? And
Yeah, I love history,
background on?
and I have 2 other writers too that work with me. So I write about half of them, and they write about half of them. And I always just say, write what you're passionate about writing.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is all about our passion. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ignore you.
Were the maintenance crews also Mexican?
They were also Mexican, yeah. They were of the 300 of the squadron, 33 were pilots. The rest were maintenance crew. Okay.
Yeah, what was the total number of airplanes that Mexicans received?
I should know that, but I don't. I mean, it did. They had some replacement, but I mean, part of the problem, is they were saying they were not only not getting replacements for pilots, but they weren't getting replacements for aircraft, and they were slowly degrading. So I would say the number's probably on the order of 50. But I mean, it wasn't enough that when they started taking combat damage and losses, that they were having trouble replacing those losses.
Were there any Mexican aces?
There was very little actually air combat. So no, there were no Mexican aces. They mostly did groundwork, which is actually, that's the grueling work of the war. And there in the Pacific, a lot of times they were flying in terrain. If you know the terrain in the Philippines, it's very difficult terrain to do ground attack. But their primary contribution was tying down Japanese troops. And MacArthur said that they tied down on the order of 30,000 Japanese troops with their dive bombing rates, but very little air combat. And I honestly don't know if there was even a single aerial victory, because they simply didn't see it very often.
So they weren't just operating on U.S. coastal waters then?
No, they were deployed to the Philippines, yeah.
Were they flying off of carriers?
No, they didn't fly off of carriers. They started in Luzon, and when the rest of the 5th Air Force moved to Okinawa, the unit was so degraded that they didn't go with them, and then they flew the Reds to Formosa from there, so they never even moved to Okinawa. They never flew off of carriers now. But I mean, it was an Army force. They were with the Army Air Forces.
You said there was 2 other squadrons that were preparing, but weren't deployed because...
They weren't deployed because the war ended, yeah. So there were 2 other pursuit squadrons. So there were 3 active squadrons during the war. 2 of those were doing coastal patrol in larger aircraft that we set up for coastal patrol. They were preparing to deploy 2 other squadrons that would have participated in the attack on Japan, which could have been quite bloody. Obviously, they never deployed.
Is
there a good resource that you could recommend to do like further reading on this, Rose?
There are a couple of good ones that were actually written by pilots, and I can send those maybe to Becca. We can put out a bibliography maybe so that you've got some resources to look at.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
What was the model of the P-47?
I had it written down. Did I say, if that's what I said, then that's what it was.
Did that have the teardrop canopy?
We just had a picture of one, didn't we?
Well,
I feel like we were just looking at a picture of one. Oh, no, it's on the brochure, it's why. It's on the flyer. Does it have the teardrop canopy?
It does.
Yes. And the one that's on the flyer, that is an Aztec Eagle. It's hard, it's black and white, to see that the colors on the tail are different, but you can see the white on the cowling. That's the reason that the American pilots call them white houses, which is kind of an interesting juxtaposition to the red tails.
Do you know if there was any sort of wanting to join with the European theatre, or was it solely Pacific that they were interested in?
Cabrero, what was his name? Now I'm forgetting the Mexican prime. The president of Mexico made that decision with Roosevelt. And I think they just decided that it would be more palatable to the nation if they were rescuing Hispanics. But the Brazilian force did deploy to the Mediterranean. And of course in 1943 there was more action in the Pacific than there was in Europe. So I don't know of any, but I mean certainly the Mexican government seemed to agree that the Philippines was the right one.
So at the end of the war, the victors always go for the spoils. And I think that was, as you had mentioned, that was one of the reasons why Mexico was able to get into the war, because they thought, well, if the Allies win, well, then we can share into the spoils.
Yes.
So were there any spoils that they did share in?
Well, as I said, they were one of the first rotating seats on the UN Security Council, and that was, I think, an important contribution. It really showed where Mexico was on the world stage. As well as the the development that came from the United States. I mean, certainly that was a cooperative thing, and they literally called that the Mexican miracle. It's interesting because the same thing happened in Iceland, and they call it the Icelandic miracle. There's a long story there. We occupied Iceland when we were both neutral, but the United States came in and we developed industry and roads and infrastructure and all sorts of things. That was part of the trade. But I think on the international scene still, I think Mexico, because it was so isolationist, wasn't really considered on the international scene. I think this made a difference, and that being on the Security Council made a difference. And I think it still affects the Mexican voice today on the world stage.
I think that's a wrap.
Is that a wrap?
All right, thanks to the history guy, Lance Geiger. As you all know, we have outstanding presentations like this on the first Wednesday of every month. Our next one will be September 7th. We will welcome back Dr. Mike Barger. Those of you who were at his last talk, he is a former Top Gun instructor, also co-founder of JetBlue Airlines, who's been in the news lately. And he will talk about his involvement with JetBlue. Think about your questions in the next one. Please remember the donation boxes off to the side and out in the hall are hungry. Your support truly does go a long way. Thank you to Becca Folsom for putting together these marvelous informative programs. Wonderful job, Becca. Thanks. Thank you all again for coming out. And until next time, bye bonds and bye. Bye-bye and bye bonds.